All right, welcome to part 2 of the Deadzone aiming tutorial. So there's been a little bit of time between when I recorded the last one and when I'm recording this one, so sorry if I seem a little discombobulated, but last time we got it set up so that the cursor shows in the middle of our screen, and now we need to make it so that we can actually move it using the mouse inside of the Deadzone. So I think I said this before, but we don't actually want to do this here. We want to keep the event tick, but we can delete this. I was just doing that to show you guys that the cursor wasn't broken because I know it looks like this otherwise. So just go ahead and delete that for right now. And then let's create a function to do stuff inside of event tick. So I'm going to add a new function and call it tick deadzone aiming. And we will drag this into our deadzone aiming category. And then we will also make it private since nobody else needs access to it. And then back in our event graph, we'll just call this inside of our tick, just like that. Just keep things a little bit more organized. So inside of here is where we're going to do all of our code for the deadzone aiming. So the first thing we want to do is create two variables to keep track of where our cursor is. And by the cursor, I mean that little white dot that's in the middle of the screen. So let's add two variables. The first one, we will call it the cursor pause, and then in parentheses here, I'm going to put screen space just to be super clear that this is in screen space. And if you don't know, screen space is values between 0 and 1, where 0, I believe, is the bottom left or the top left. I don't remember. And 1 is either the bottom right or the top right. One of you guys will probably yell at me in the comments about which one it is. Anyways, we want to change this to a point, or yeah, int point. Or actually, what do we want to make this? No, we want to make this a vector 2D because we want it to be float value. So make it a vector 2D. And then we will also drag this into the deadzone aiming category, and we will also make it private. And then we can actually just duplicate this. So right click and say duplicate. And then let's call this one the previous cursor position, because we actually want to keep track of where it previously was, because we're going to need that whenever we start handling the rotation of the character. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the previous value to the current. So drag in the previous and say set, and drag in the current and say get, and then hook this up like so. And then we actually are going to want to do a sequence because we're going to want to do two things here. So this is the first thing. So let's add a sequence over here on the left. So you can just hold down the S key and then left click, and that'll create a sequence. You can also create one by right clicking and searching for sequence. And so we want to hook this up, and then this is going to go into the top part. And then I'm just going to move this up here and just add a little reroute node to make it cleaner. So the first thing we do is we save the previous cursor position. And then the next thing we need to do is update the actual cursor position. So we want the cursor position to be wherever the mouse is, basically. So we can say get player controller, and make sure you get this one over here. If it pops up, because there's two now, because there's just to explain, there's this one and there's this one, right? They're named the same thing. We want this top one here, which is the one over here. And that gets the player controller for our character. And we can drag off of this and say get mouse position. And so this is going to give us the location of the mouse. But this is a value from, well, this value changes based on the size of your screen. So like up here, it's going to be 0, 0, but down here, it's going to be like 1,000, 1,000 or something. And we want to convert this to a value from 0 to 1. So we need to divide it by the viewport size. So we can say get viewport size, just like this. We want to divide it, so I'm going to make this into a vector 2D real quick. So we'll say make vector 2D and plug the x into the x and the y in the y, and then we'll do a divide. So just type divide. We want vector by vector, and then we want to hook that up like so. And so now this is going to give us the value of our mouse between 0 and 1. And then we want to save this value into our cursor position. So we'll drag in our cursor position and say set, and we'll hook that up like so. And then just to kind of show you guys what's going on here, we'll do a little print string. and then we will print out this value just real quick. So if we hit play, you can see our screen's all white. That's fine because we need to fix the cursor thing. But you can see when the mouse is on the top left, it's 0, 0, and when it's in the bottom right, it is 1, 1. So yeah, its top left is 0, 0, and bottom right is 1, 1. So now we're kind of tracking the cursor position, and I'm going to delete this because we don't really need this print string anymore. The next thing we want to do is handle when the player moves the mouse left or right. So currently, if we go back to our event graph here, that's already being handled. If you go up and you zoom in here to this mouse input section, and we actually don't want to do this, right? Because just because the player, or just because the person playing the game moves the mouse, that doesn't necessarily mean they want to rotate the character, which is what this is doing. We only want to rotate the character if the mouse or the cursor gets to the edge of the screen. So I'm actually just going to delete this, and we're going to handle it inside of here. So back in tick aim, let's create two functions, one for handling the turn and one for handling the looking up, basically. So add a function over here and call it handle turn, and then we will make this private and move it into the Deadzone aiming category. And we want this to take in the axis amount. So hit the plus button next to inputs, and then hit float, and then we'll just call this the axis value, and compile, save, and then let's just go ahead and duplicate this guy. So right click, duplicate, and we'll say handle look up. And that is good. And so now back here in our tick Deadzone aiming function, we will call these two functions. So let's say handle turn. And then for the axis value, we want whatever the delta of the mouse is. And to get that, we can just say get turn. Now, if you don't see this here, if you don't see turn here, that's because of your project settings. So I'm just going to add this real quick and hook it up, and then I'll explain just in case somebody doesn't see this. So all this is doing is it's getting the value of the turn axis, and that's in our project settings. So we go to project settings and we go to input, and we look at our axis mappings. You can see the first person project by default comes with turn and lookup. And you can see turn is bound to mouse X and it's set to a scale of 1. And lookup is bound to mouse Y and it's set to a scale of -1. So if you don't already have these, or you have them named something differently, well, if you don't already have them, then add them. If you have them named something differently, then you're going to need to type that name differently back over here. So you'd say, get look right or whatever you have turn called. But that's all that is. So it's just getting that value for this frame. And then we also wanted to do the same thing for look up. So we'll drag this in. And then I'll drag off this and say get look up. And I guess we can just write these functions because they're going to be pretty similar, but obviously they have some differences to them. So let's go into handle turn and we'll do that one first. So again, this is just handling when the character turns the mouse, which is this left and right movement like I'm doing right here. So essentially the way Deadzone aiming works, if you look at my other project here, when I turn the mouse, you can see the camera obviously doesn't rotate, but the gun does. And then once I get to a certain point over here, then it starts turning. And again, if I get to a certain point over here, then it starts turning, right? So we kind of want to check if the cursor is currently in that range or not, like the center of the screen range. So we can take our cursor position that we created earlier and bring that in. And we only want to look at the X value, right? Because we're going left or right. So we can right click on this and say split struct pin. And again, we want to check if this X value is in a specific range. So we can say in range. And then the range here is, well, you can set this to kind of whatever you want. I'm going to create some macros for it just to make it a little bit easier because we're going to end up using it in a couple places. But you can kind of think of the screen like, so the left side's 0 and the right side's 1, right? So the mouse starts at 0.5, which is right in the middle. So we're basically saying, okay, how far to the left or the right can it go? So if you set it to 0.5, you're saying it can go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. If you set it to 0.25, then it means it can go half the way to the left or half the way to the right before the screen starts moving. So the higher number you set for this, the bigger your dead zone will be, basically. But yeah, let's make some macros for these just so it's a little easier later. So I'm going to create a macro over here on the left and call it inner zone left. So this is the left side of the screen. Let me just to show you what I'm doing. So if this is your screen, if this is your whole screen, the dead zone is something like this, right? So anywhere, so if your cursor is anywhere inside this purple area, this is the dead zone. So we need to know, what is the value, like what is the inner dead zone left side, what is the right side, and what is the top and the bottom. So, this here in the middle might be like, or so this here in the middle is 0.5, and then this over here is 1, and this over here is 0. So for something like this, then this value would be like, 0.8 maybe, and this value would be 0.2. So these are the values I'm setting up right now, just these edge values, right? So the inner dead zone left, that would be this left side. We want to set that to 0.5 minus whatever we want it to be. So we'll say float minus, and this is going to be 0.5. And then I'm going to promote this to a variable so it's easy for us to change. And we will call this inner zone half x. And the reason I'm calling it half x is because it is it's this distance from 0.5 to the edge. So it's this distance right here. So it's half the width of the dead zone. So inner zone half x. So in this case, if we want the sides to be 0.2 and 0.8, then we need to set the half distance, which again is this. We need to set it to 0.3, right? Because 0.5 minus 0.3 is 0.2, and 0.5 plus 0.3 is 0.8. So you can adjust these values for your game depending on how much of a dead zone you want. But I'm going to say 0.3. And then I'm going to take this and drag it into my dead zone aiming category, and I'm going to make it private, blueprint read only. And then I'm going to add this to a constants category or a subcategory. So to the right here, I'm going to hold down Shift and then press the backslash button, which is the button above enter or below backspace. And it makes like a vertical pipe. And that's how you make a subcategory. And then the subcategory I'm going to call constants. So you'll see over here on the left, there's now a constants category underneath the dead zone aiming category. And the reason I'm making it constant is because I selected blueprint read only up here, which makes it constant. So if I try to drag it in, you can see I can't actually set it. And that's because, well, it's a constant value. It's not a value, or it's not a variable that's going to be changing at runtime while the game's running. It's just like a constant variable that you set ahead of time, kind of like a setting. And I like to separate my variables like that so I know which ones are meant to be constants and which ones are not. But anyways, sorry for the side trail. So hook this up, and this is going to be our output value. So just really simply. And then let's just do the same thing for the other macros as well while we're here, and then that will just make things easier. So right click, duplicate this, and call it inner zone right. You could call this dead zone right, maybe. That would be a better name. I'm just going to stick with this. So inner zone right. So this is going to be the same thing, except it's going to be plus here. So we're going to say float plus, and then make sure on the top you have 0.5, and then on the bottom you have your half width. And then we want to do the same thing for y, or up and down basically. So I'm just going to duplicate this again, and we'll call this inner zone top. And again, that inner zone is just that purple zone from this drawing here. So the inner zone top is going to be half y, so we need to make a variable for half y. So we'll right click, say duplicate, inner zone half y, and compile, and then I'm going to leave this as 0.3. So make sure you have both of these set to 0.3. If you have it set to 0, then it's not going to work very well. Well, it's not going to work at all. So for our inner zone top, we want to change this to be, let's just delete both of these. So we want our inner zone half y, and then we want float minus, and we want 0.5, and we want this going into the bottom here, like so, because that's the top, so we're going to subtract. And then the last one is inner zone bottom, so right click, duplicate, call it inner zone bottom. Oh, and I just realized I added an extra T up here. I want that. And so for this one, we just want to do a plus. So we'll say float plus, and then again 0.5, since that's the center of the screen, plus our half y. All right, so now we have all of our macros created for easily changing or easily getting the value of the left, the right, the top, and the bottom of the screen. And we can really easily change how big we want our dead zone or our inner zone to be using these two values right here. And then I'm just going to add these to a dead zone category as well, just to keep things consistent. So dead zone aiming, and I'm just going to drag these guys in as well. All right. Now that we have that set up, we can go back to our handle turn function. And this is going to make it a lot easier for us. So we're saying our x value is the range, or the value we want to make sure it's in this range, or we want to check if it's in this range. And the range is going to be the left side of the screen, so we'll drag in our left, to the right side of the screen, so we'll drag in our right. And then we want to drag off of this and say not boolean, because we want to actually check if it's not within that dead zone. So we do a branch here. So what this is checking is cursor outside of dead zone on the x axis, and the x axis being left and right, because we're in 2D space. So if it isn't, then we don't want to do anything. So we're not going to do anything off this false. But if it is, then we want to make sure we clamp the cursor to the edge of the screen, because you'll notice when I run this, once my cursor gets to that side of the screen, the left side of the screen, or well, the left side of the dead zone, I should say, it doesn't keep going. It stops there. So that's what we're going to do right here. So to do that, we want to clamp our cursor position. So we'll drag in our cursor position and say set, and then hook this up to the true. And then essentially we want to take it and we want to drag it in down here and say get. And then we want to know if it is less than 0.5 or greater than 0.5, because we need to check is the cursor on the left side or is it on the right side? Because obviously we need to clamp it differently depending on which side it's on. So we'll say, oh, actually, let's split this because we're only looking at the x here. We'll say float less than 0.5. And then we'll drag off this and use the select node. And make sure you get this yellow one down here, select. And then we will split this guy. And so I guess real quick, so the y value can just stay the same. So we'll just drag the y value up, and then I'm going to double click to add a reroute node. And then this is what we want to go into here. So we're saying if x is less than 0.5, that means it's on the left side of the screen. So that would mean we want to use the inner zone left. So we'll drag in inner zone left. If it's greater than 0.5, that means the cursor is on the right side of the screen. So that means we want to clamp it to the inner zone right. So we'll drag in the inner zone right. Okay. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to actually apply the rotation to the character, because remember, once the cursor gets all the way to the left, then the character actually starts to rotate. So once the cursor is already on the left or all the way on the right, we actually want to rotate the character as well. And so we want to do that off of this true here, since that's when we know it's on the side. And so we will use the same function that I was using before. So add controller y'all input. And then the value here is going to be the axis that was passed in. So if you remember, we have an axis value over here. So you can right click and say get axis value, which will get us a copy of that. And then if we pass this in here, that will work, but then we won't really be able to easily control the speed of it. So let's just multiply it by a speed value. So let's say float multiply. And then I'm actually going to hijack these values, this base turn rate and base look rate. So these were already here, but I'm going to hijack them for our purposes. So I'm going to drag these into the constants category because we actually want to use these still. And I'm going to make them private, both of them private. And then I'm going to turn them down quite a bit. So they're at 45. I'm going to set them to 0.1. Again, you can play with these values once we're all done, but basically the bigger number you put here, the faster the character will turn. But I think 0.1 works for this pretty well. Okay, so since we're in the handle turn function, we're going to use the base turn rate. So drag that in and hook that up there. All right, so that is our turn function done. And the handle lookup function is actually going to be really similar, but it's different enough that we are going to put it into a different function. So, but just as kind of a template, let's just copy all of this other than this node, obviously. And then let's just paste this in the handle turn function, and then we'll modify it. So go to we'll paste it in the handle lookup function. So go to handle lookup and then paste, and then just hook it up like we had before. And then we'll change this comment first because I'll probably forget otherwise. So this is now checking on the y-axis. Okay, so over here, obviously we want to do a little bit different because we're looking at the y and not the x. So we want to unhook this and move it into the Y. And by the way, the shortcut for that is control and then drag. You can switch pins around if you just control drag. And so we don't want left and right anymore. We want top and bottom. So we'll say top and bottom, and then make sure you hook these up to the min and the max. Okay, and so that's good. And then let's keep going here. So we want to switch this logic around, right? So I'm going to actually move this up top because the X is just going to go straight across here. And then the Y is going to go into this check here. And then we don't need this one at all. So it should look something like this. Let me move it over a little bit. So you have the X going into the X, you have the Y going down here, and then you have this guy going up here. And then we again want to change these out. So we're going to have bottom and top now since it's the Y. So bottom goes into false and top goes into true. Pile and save, and it's just yelling at us about this. So just delete this variable and then re-add it. So get axis value. And then finally, the last thing we want to change, well, the last two things we want to change the base turn rate to the base lookup rate since this is the Y. So just drag that on there and we'll switch it. And then obviously, instead of doing yaw, we want to do pitch. So delete this guy and say add controller pitch. Hook that up and hook that up. Okay. So now if we go back to our event graph here, let me see, where are we? Or not our event graph, sorry. If we go back inside of tick Deadzone aiming, well, we can see what happens. We're only like halfway done, so it's not going to be pretty. Actually, it's not going to be, it's going to have this white screen first because we haven't fixed that. So let's fix that real quick. So yeah, we need to call that set position and viewport in order to fix that. So let's grab our cursor widget and say set position and viewport. And so the position we want to set it to is going to be the cursor position. So drag in the cursor position. But again, this is in screen space and this is expecting it in like viewport space. So we want to split this and then we want to multiply the viewport size. So we say get viewport size and we will say float multiply, or no, sorry. We need to say vector 2D multiply. And then I'm going to put this one in the, oops, I'm going to put this one in the bottom. Actually, we can just recombine this because, yeah, that's fine, I think. My other project, I had it differently, but I don't see why we can't just do it this way. So we multiply these together, and then this is going to go into here. So now if we run this, you can see as I move the cursor, if I don't click into the screen, I can see both, which is kind of useful. So you can see as I move my mouse, the little cursor thing moves around with it until I get past my dead zone, and then it stops moving. So it should look like this. And if I click into the screen, then it starts actually rotating my character as well. It's a little wonky right now because, well, we're not quite done yet, but you can kind of get the idea of it working already. So what we need to do next is we need to make sure that the cursor doesn't go beyond the edge. Because right now, if I run this again and I go over here, you can see the actual cursor, or sorry, the mouse, like the normal Windows mouse, the pointy one, it keeps going past the edge of the screen. So then when I start trying to go back, it doesn't start, well, it doesn't start rotating my gun right away, but we haven't written that code yet. So I'm trying to explain it the best I can. But basically, we want the mouse and the cursor to always be in the same spot. So we want the mouse not to be able to keep going like this, right? We want it to always be in the same location as the cursor. So before we do this, we want to update the mouse position, which is the pointy one, right, to the cursor position, which is the dot. So let's just make a little function for that. And we'll just call it set mouse. Oops, that's a macro up here. We'll just call it set mouse pause to cursor pause, and then private, and then drag it into the Deadzone aiming category. So inside of here, we want to, again, get the cursor position. So actually, let's go and make that a function as well. So back in the pick deadzone aiming, let's just take this little bit of code right here and right click and say collapse to function. And we will call this get cursor uh, viewport position. And I'm going to make this pure and constant. File save. And then I'm going to drag it into the deadzone aiming category. Okay, so now back here, we can reuse this function. So we want to get the cursor position in the viewport. And then we want to ultimately say get player controller. So I'm going to drag in get player controller. And we want to say set mouse position, right? Because we want the mouse to be wherever the cursor is. And if we split this, we can drag the X into the X and the Y into the Y. By default, it creates these truncate variables, which obviously truncate the number, but we actually want it to round the number because if it's closer to the right side of the screen, we want it to go up, and if it's closer to the left side of the screen, we want it to go down. So actually delete these and say round. And so that will round it, as you would normally round a number. Because we need to round a float to an int, like that. All right, so now if we hook up this little function, so set mouse cursor, or set mouse position to cursor position, if we hook that up in between here, like this, then we should, let me just double check that I did that right. Yeah, okay. So we should be almost done here with this part. We just need to do the gun rotation. So now, oops, let me, okay, so now you can see if I try to move my mouse past the edge, it kind of snaps back. And it looks really jittery on the mouse, but that's okay because you're not going to actually see the mouse in the game. You're only going to see the cursor, and the cursor doesn't jitter. So it's basically just making sure that the mouse doesn't keep going off the edge, which is what we want. Okay, so finally, the last thing we need to do here is the actual gun rotation, right? Because the gun needs to rotate. And I think we'll just go ahead and do that in part 3 because it's a decent amount of work. I mean, it's probably only take 10 minutes or something, but we'll just go ahead and do that in part 3. So I'll see you guys in part 3.